Hello, everybody. The purpose of this presentation is to give you some insight into our transition from an A through F grading model to a standards-based grading model. I'll start by acknowledging that this presentation will be quick and fairly simplified. So if you'd like a more extensive explanation, please watch the Principal Coffee from May 27th, 2022, where teachers and administrators delve more deeply into the topic for parents and guardians. I'm hopeful that after watching this brief presentation that you will understand some of the challenges with a 100-point A through F grading system, that you understand the purpose and function of educational standards, learn some of the key components of a standards-based grading system, and anticipate what this shift will look like going into the next school year. Before we get started, for a moment I'd like you to consider that you're a student who's learning to play an instrument, for example. If you're interested in improving in that instrument and you delivered a performance, would it be more valuable for you to receive a letter grade summarizing all elements of that performance in one simple score, like a B minus, for example? Or would it be more helpful to get feedback about specific elements of your musicianship? For example, the accuracy with the notes that you played, the accuracy with which you played the written music, and the presence that you had on stage. Which of those two forms of feedback, a simple letter or feedback related to specific elements of your performance, would be more helpful for you if your interest was to improve in that skill the next time that you did it? A through F grading was developed in the 19th century and became a popular means of capturing student performance in colleges in the 1930s. The primary function of this 100-point A through F scale was to rank students so that we could judge and predict a student's ability and potential for the workforce they were going to be entering. The problem is that as you fast forward over 100 years, we are now misrepresenting that an A through F grade somehow reflects a student's learning and ability with a subject, when in reality a letter grade can mean a lot of different things. Because letter grades were developed in the Industrial Revolution, they reflect beliefs of the Industrial Revolution. The fact of the matter is our schedule and our feedback is from the 19th century. A lot of our curriculum is from the 20th century, and yet we are attempting to educate 21st century learners. So in the Industrial Revolution, people believed that student achievement occurred on a curve, and that only a subset of students were capable of meeting academic standards. Whereas now, we believe that all students are capable of meeting academic standards. Back in the Industrial Revolution, schools were expected to sort students. Now, our objective is to ensure that all students learn the knowledge and skills expected at each grade level. Back in the Industrial Revolution, extrinsic motivation was the priority and believed to be most effective to influence behaviors. Now we understand that extrinsic motivation is not the best motivator for learning, but rather finding ways to ensure that students are intrinsically motivated results in superior learning outcomes. And so we ask ourselves, why are we using a system that was developed in the 19th century to provide feedback in a 21st century education model? And there are additional challenges with A through F grading. A through F grades reduce a trimester worth of learning into one score or marking. Traditional grades can diminish student interest in what they are learning as the focus becomes, how do I get points? Traditional grades will encourage kids to go for the easiest possible task in order to feel as successful as possible, and it can encourage cheating. We also see it reduces the quality of student thinking, where points are the most important thing in completing a task. Points are the motivation versus the learning, which is the intrinsic motivation. And unfortunately, there are some students, in fact, I might say many students, who use a traditional grade to define self-worth. Some might argue that because high schools and colleges use an A through F grading system, middle schools should do the same. And yet, Alfie Kohn, educational researcher and prominent author who is an advocate for standards-based grading, states, traditional grading has been shown to reduce the quality of learning, interest in learning, and preference for challenging tasks. But the fact that students' effort will be reduced to a letter or a number in the future is seen as sufficient justification for giving them grades in the present. The best way to prepare kids for the bad things they're going to encounter later is not to do bad things to them now. And so I'd like to give a little further insight around the numbers with traditional A through F grading and how that A through F grade can misrepresent what a student needs to work on. And I will say that this is an oversimplified representation, and yet it does still capture the essence of some of the challenges with A through F grading. Here you have two students, Samantha and Suzanne, and as you can see, their final trimester grade is a B-. And yet Samantha really excelled with tests and quizzes, yet struggled with class activities and participation, while Suzanne struggled with tests and quizzes, but did well with class activities and participation. The ending grade gives very little insight into the areas of strength and challenge for these two students over the course of the trimester. It would be much more helpful to understand exactly what Suzanne struggled with on tests and quizzes in order to know whether Suzanne was in fact learning the material from that course. Furthermore, if you look below at an example of trimester 1 test scores, you can clearly see that Suzanne's scores improved over the course of the trimester, and by assessment 6, 7, and 8, she was achieving the vast majority of the content on the assessment. And yet, by averaging those assessments over the course of the trimester, it doesn't represent the learning that she achieved by the end with that final score of 70%. Instead, it averages everything together and represents her learning as a holistic representation of the whole trimester, not creating space to acknowledge that perhaps she had met standards in those final assessments of the trimester. So as you can see, even though A through F grading is based in numbers which people believe represent student learning, we can see that those numbers and the grades they result in can be very misleading. In public education, we are bound to teach students the standards that have been identified for each grade level. These standards show what students know and should be able to do at each grade level. They're learning statements about what students will learn through instruction. In English and math, those are the Common Core standards. In science, they're the Next Generation Science standards. The History Social Science framework provides direction for history instruction, and there's even standards for PE, music, and language. Standards guide curriculum and instruction in each course taught, and students deserve specific feedback about their progress on the most essential learning standards. So for example, here are some standards for an 8th grade English class. Reading with stamina, identifying theme and central idea, and citing textual evidence. Here are some writing standards. Structure, development, about making a claim and supporting it with logical evidence. Conventions, editing and writing and using tools. Very specific statements about what students are learning and showing us that they're able to do. Here's an example of learning targets in mathematics. 7th grade, adding and subtracting rational numbers, multiplying and dividing rational numbers, expressions. These are examples of standards that are covered in 8th grade English and 7th grade mathematics. And these are examples of ways to indicate a student's progress towards the standard in any class. Clearly, we would want students to be meeting standard, and yet students do show us evidence of when they're just beginning progress on standard, or perhaps approaching that standard. At times, students even show us evidence that they are exceeding standards. So how do we make this visible for students? Here's an example of a proficiency scale that could be used in a classroom. In fact, this proficiency scale was used in one of our math classrooms this year. Students were very clearly communicated the standard, write, interpret, and explain statements of order and absolute value for rational numbers. And then there's language on this proficiency scale which very clearly states what it looks like to meet standards. the student can explain and find the concept of absolute value and successfully compare and order integers and rational numbers. Furthermore, it shows what it looks like to be approaching that standard, so that if a student isn't yet meeting, they can see what they are able to do and what they are not yet able to do. As well as exceeding standard. What does it mean to be above grade level and exceeding work on the standard? As you can see in this proficiency scale, it makes learning and progress visible for students. So far, we've been talking about standards of learning and skills. And it's important to also recognize that students have specific habits that they're working on at school, habits of learning. And so in a standards-based grading system, we try to tease out the difference between the learning outcomes as well as the habits of learning that students are applying, so that a student may be highly engaged in a class and we could give them positive feedback for that, and yet they might still be approaching standard with their learning targets. Standards-based grading provides the opportunity to give both of those areas of feedback on their habits as well as feedback on their learning. The draft habits of learning that Kent Middle School is considering for next year include independence, engagement, work completion, collaboration, community-mindedness, and organization. The beauty of a standards-based grading system is that we're able to give students feedback about their areas of strength and challenge with their work habits that's different than their areas of strength and challenge with their learning. In an A through F grading system, that all gets combined together to shoot out one letter grade that is very difficult to understand where the areas of strength and challenge for a student might lie. So here's a sample report card that a student might get from Kent Middle School right now. This is student A, and student A earned a B+ in English Language Arts with the comment, participates well in class. An A- in math with the comment, improve homework completion. These grades are very simplified with a very brief comment. And as a student or a parent, unless you are very closely monitoring assessment outcomes, assignments, the gradebook and ARIES, it is exceedingly difficult to know what are my next steps in English Language Arts to improve, and how might I improve my learning in mathematics. Without further investigation, it is close to impossible to know what those next steps should be. In a standards-based learning feedback system, the report card looks more like this. In English Language Arts, a student is given feedback about whether they are beginning, approaching, meeting, or exceeding standard in the essential standards for that trimester. Here we can clearly see that a student is meeting standard with theme, central idea, and citing textual evidence, however, approaching standard with their reading stamina. If I were a student getting this feedback, I'd know exactly where I should focus my attention. Furthermore, I've received feedback about my collaboration from this teacher, and I can see that I'm just beginning with my progress towards collaboration. So now I would know my focus should be on reading stamina and the way that I work with others in my class. Similarly, this is what standards-based feedback could look like in a math class. Here I can clearly see that I'm meeting standards in 3 of the standard areas for this trimester, and yet I should really focus my attention on multiplying and dividing rational numbers because I'm only approaching standard in this area. Again, this has been a brief presentation to give an introduction to the rationale for standards-based grading and what it could look like in our classrooms. Our intention is to transition to standards-based grading at Kent Middle School for the 2022-23 school year. Here are some frequently asked questions about standards-based grading. How will my child be motivated if they're not working towards grades? Many families use grades as a motivating tool. However, grades were never designed for the school to be a motivating tool. We use grades to give feedback to students and families about their learning. And as I've mentioned in this presentation, that feedback has really missed the mark with regard to helping students know how to improve next. And so while grades can be motivating for some students, we're going to work to develop the intrinsic motivation that comes with specific feedback about what a student is doing well and where a student needs to be improving. There are many standards for each grade level. How can you possibly give feedback on them all? We continue to intend to teach to all the standards. However, teachers have gone through a process of prioritizing essential standards, the most essential ideas for each trimester to give students concrete feedback on. So while it's not possible to give feedback on all standards, it is much more helpful to get feedback on 4 or 5 standards each trimester rather than simply a letter grade that is very difficult to interpret. If a child's above grade level proficiency, why wouldn't they exceed standard in all areas? As you could see from the proficiency scale, exceeding standard requires evidence of very specific skills that students are able to do with the standard. So some students may exceed a number of standards. However, some standards may not be possible to exceed. The goal for all of our students should be to be meeting standards in each one of their classes and working towards that meeting standard. Will my child be ready for high school in the A through F grading system in most high schools and colleges? Fortunately, the surrounding middle schools in Marin have already transitioned to standards-based grading. In fact, each of the feeder schools to Redwood High School, Ross, Del Mar, and Hall, have already transitioned to standards-based grading feedback. And what we've heard from the high schools is that it's actually been very helpful information to receive about children entering into their schools. So we are transitioning at a time when we have a lot to learn from surrounding schools that have already gone through this transition, and the support of the receiving high school that they have seen that students are prepared and can transition into an A through F system in high school, when the high schools are bound to maintain that system because of college entrance criteria. And lastly, will this hurt my child's chance to get into private high school? Again, because the surrounding schools in Marin have already transitioned to standards-based grading, we have the insight to determine that, in fact, students were still accepted to private high schools at the same, if not increased rate for schools that had already transitioned to standards-based grading. We also have documented support from Marin Catholic as well as Branson School championing a standards-based grading system as a helpful system for our students. So in conclusion, I hope that this has been helpful. Again, it is a very brief summary, but hopefully illuminates some of the rationale behind this shift in feedback and grading and what you can expect to see from your child's grading system at Kent Middle School for the 2022-23 school year. Thank you so much for your time.